I don't know about you, I love carbohydrates. They're so delicious. Yeah, I feel guilty about it, which makes me feel a little bit better, but they're a really important source of energy for us, but there's so much more. Let's take a brief look at what carbohydrates do in living organisms. So the most basic carbohydrates we would just call sugars. And the building blocks there are these monosaccharides. Well, you work with glucose quite a bit, but you've probably heard of fructose and galactose as well. Disaccharides, when you put together two of the monosaccharides, you get a variety of things like sucrose, which is table sugar, and lactose that you find in dairy products. All of these are soluble in water and make a great source of energy. Usually that gets transported around in fluids. In plants, this goes up and down the stem in sap, and in animals, it goes around in our bloodstream as blood sugar. Now, the polysaccharides are really just lots of repeating units of glucose, and you can see that they have different structures in terms of whether they're branched or not and how they're branched. But the polysaccharides, their functions vary depending on if you are plant, animal, or fungus. Most of them have to do with energy, but not all of them. So if you're a plant, this is how you store energy. So if you've had a potato, that's the plant storing energy. If you're an animal or a fungus, then this is an energy source for food, but we don't store energy as starch, we store it as fat or glycogen. So that's how animals and fungi both store their energy as glycogen. Plants don't really use glycogen at all. If you're a plant, then this is what you make your cell walls out of that gives you strength and helps you stand up. If you're an animal, then it's probably just fiber in your diet because we cannot digest it. If you're a fungus, however, then that's your food. You can digest cellulose, and so can bacteria. How do you tell any of those apart? Yep, that's a great question. They are very difficult to recognize, especially when you first start. Here's a few tips. So whenever you see a hexagon with an oxygen in the corner, probably a carbohydrate, especially if it's really just made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Another tip there is when you look at all these guys, and this is an abbreviated version of it, if you're seeing these in a ratio of 1 to 2 to 1, kind of in the name, right? Carbohydrate, H2O, then also a carbohydrate. If it's only made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, then chances are about the only other thing it would be is a lipid, which has a lot less oxygen. So if the carbon and oxygens are about equal, probably a carbohydrate. But telling the difference between the polysaccharides is tough, because like most biomolecules, because they're built out of these building blocks, like Legos, right? They're all identical except for one small feature, in this case, the color, which is easy to see, but that's not as easy to see in individual monomers or the biomolecule building blocks. And what makes it even harder with carbohydrates is the most common ones we look at are just glucose. It's just glucose, 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 glucose. So what's the difference between a couple? Let's take a look at one of them. Let's compare starch and cellulose. Two big polysaccharides, both made out of repeating units of glucose. So what is the difference? It just looks like a bunch of hexagons. True, but look at the bonding here. The bond between these two glucose molecules and these two is the same. But let's go down here to cellulose. That bond goes downward, and this one is up. And this one is down, and this one is up. And that's the only difference. Isn't that crazy? That makes starch a ready and available energy source for us, but cellulose completely undigestible. Pretty minor difference, but apparently to our enzymes, it makes all the difference. So that's a brief look at carbohydrates. A really important energy source, but also important structurally to build cell walls in things like plants, fungi, and even the exoskeletons of insects and lobsters and things like that. Plus, they're delicious. Life is good.